The world's longest-running monarchy, the imperial house in Japan, is handing power from one generation to the next. But can any system of inherited wealth and influence go on forever? Or will time run out for the world's royal families? Welcome to Roundtable with me, David Foster. The Emperor of Japan is stepping aside and his son is taking his place. This succession, based on birth lines, is repeated in countries across the world where monarchies have withstood social and political change over centuries.
Japan has the world's longest-standing monarchy, and its first abdication in 200 years is a historic event. Emperor Akihito is stepping down, ending the 30 years Heisei era. A new age known as Reiwa is beginning, ushered in by Akihito's eldest son, Crown Prince Naruhito. Japan has a constitutional monarchy, so the emperor holds no political power. Critics say constitutional monarchies are a financial burden on the population, arguing that the royals and their traditions are outdated with no real relevance in modern society. The abdication of King Juan Carlos of Spain in 2014 prompted calls for a referendum on abolishing the monarchy. Republicans in Britain are calling for a national vote on the future of the monarchy after the Queen dies, although polls suggest there's little support right now. But does privilege and influence that is inherited, not merited, have a place in the modern world?
And I'm very pleased to say that joining me at the round table from Munich, we have Dr. Daniel Schley, lecturer at the Department of Japanese and Korean Studies at Bonn University. In the studio, the royal commentator, Richard Fitzwilliams. Maria Luisa Marino is here, author and journalist for Royalty magazine, and Jeff Hicks, senior lecturer at the School of History at the University of East Anglia. Warm welcome to each and every one of you. Let's go to Bonn first of all, and Daniel, specifically about the Japanese royal family. How did the current emperor, which he is for the next few hours anyway, how did Akihito differ from his father, Hirohito? And how will the new emperor, Naruhito, differ from his father? What has changed since the Second World War?
It has, a lot of things has changed. During the reign of the still present emperor, which will be called the Heisei reign, which is the era name of his reign, the idea of the symbol emperorship, which was declared in the constitution after the war, the present constitution of Japan in 47, in this constitution, the emperor was reduced to just being the symbol of the unity of the nation and its people. And this differs completely from the former constitution of the Empire of Japan, where the emperor was called like a divine being. He was inviolable, and he was also, well, the leader of the military, etc. And now with the change first from the Second World War, the Pacific War, to contemporary Japan. And then in 1809, when Akihito's father died, these two steps are very, very important to understand the present situation of the tenure.
So it goes from divine to mortal.
Yes.
And here we have Akihito, who sort of takes it a step further and becomes almost ascetic in many ways by adopting a sort of hard-working monastic existence in a way, marrying into not into the royal family, but by picking the daughter of an industrialist. His period of rule seemed to many people to embody sort of middle-class liberal values rather than the strict Japanese cultural values of old. How will his son differ from him?
Well, it's difficult to say now because the still present emperor has done a great effort to be close to his people, which is different also to his father. And the crown prince, Naruhito, then tomorrow will be today's emperor, he said that, of course, he will follow his father's steps. But when you think about the media coverage and the problems behind the future succession, because he and his wife, they don't have a male successor, he will have a difficult stand, I think, in the Imperial Household Agency.
Daniel, we'll come back to you in just a moment. Richard, there have been problems within the Japanese royal family, not least because of the adaptation or the way they've had to adapt to 21st century, but in terms of the pressures as well.
The pressures are tremendous. Since 1867, the Japanese emperor assumed this divine status until the 1947 constitution. Subsequently, of course, the emperor being mortal, this was Hirohito and subsequently Akihito, but when Emperor Naruhito succeeds tomorrow, the challenge will be to become slightly more human, simply because of the past and the fact that if you look at the current situation, both the current empress and also the empress-to-be Masako have suffered from severe depression because of the pressures exerted by the Imperial Household Agency, which guards the monarchy as though it was some sort of sacred trust. One of the difficulties is that unlike so many other monarchs in Europe, for example, the chrysanthemum throne, I mean, I think you would rather be on the dark side of the moon. The Imperial Household Agency is about 100,000 adherents. They guard everything they do, what they are linked to, how they are photographed, if at all. It is an extraordinary situation. It needs to change.
It's almost like they can't win because they need to modernize to be part of the modern world, but at the same time they're not allowed to do so by those people who want to adhere to the old traditions.
But the craziest thing of all is this business of the so-called need for a male successor and the fact that...
What we call primogeniture, generally.
Primogeniture, of course, is the fact that the male child is regarded as superior to the female and leaps above the female in the line of succession. In Japan, at the moment, you cannot have a female empress.
Got it now, got it, yeah.
Yes, but the ridiculous thing is they've had 8. The last was Empress Gosa Kuramachi in 1762. They've had 8 empresses in the past, and therefore it is an absolute farce that the...
Okay, so we've got to assume that it is still steeped in tradition,
yes,
tradition that perhaps the Japanese royal family itself would love to see change, not least for personal pressures, Jeff, but how does that compare to the pressures on other European households? I know you know quite a bit about European households. So would you pick the British royal family as the most austere and old-fashioned of the European households?
Probably of the of the European monarchs, yes, I suppose. I mean, I'm not sure austere any longer applies to the British monarchy, but it's probably the one that's kept the most trappings and ritual and ceremony attached to its monarchy. And if you contrast it with, say, the Dutch royal family or the Danish royal family, where people think nothing of...
Shall I say aloof rather than austere?
Perhaps, yes, perhaps, although I suspect that the present younger members of the royal family are doing their best to move away from that. But I think the critical thing for the Japanese monarchy, if it is to continue to survive, will be how effectively it adapts and changes over the coming years, because all the successful monarchies have managed to adapt and change subtly in some cases, more dramatically in others, over the last century or so. And actually, the really interesting story is the survival of monarchy over the last 100 years or so. I think if you'd have asked people in a sort of imaginary panel discussion at the end of the 19th century, and as people rose up against governments and there was a huge amount of change in the offing, I suspect people would have said, oh, I'm not sure monarchs will last. And if you told them, an awful lot of them would still be around in the early 21st century.
So you talked about the most successful examples. Which ones would you choose? If you were in Japan and you wanted to change the Japanese monarchy, bearing in mind that it's a different culture altogether,
yes,
which royal house would you look at to see a successful change?
Well, I think part of the problem there is you've got to find the one that works within the culture you have. So the Danish model is probably one of the most informal, where you might think nothing of going out to a restaurant in the city and seeing the king and queen, or the queen at present, sorry, having dinner together. The British monarchy wouldn't behave like that, but both of them equally successful. I think the Dutch model has been very successful. One of the interesting things about most of the constitutional monarchies in Europe is that they have realised when time's up and they've abdicated. So we've seen a number of monarchs over the last few years realise they're either getting too old or public opinion's becoming problematic or whatever, and they've retired effectively.
Well, we will get onto that a little bit later on, because we have a generational
yes,
thing in the United Kingdom which is worth discussing, isn't it, about whether it needs to go to the younger generation straight away after the death of the current Queen. But Maria Luisa, I know you're saying no, but
yes.
Maria Luisa,
Yes.
let me ask you, because you've got to know the royal family relatively well. This
Yes.
is a book you have here that you've written about the Queen Mother.
Yes.
Do you think they accept the need for change, or is there still resistance? As Richard was saying, from the household, not necessarily
Yes.
from the family.
I think they're changing already. And there's a more relaxation also in the way they approach the different charities and the different areas where they have to go and present themselves to many of the different requests, because they've got about 2,000 requests continually. So the Queen has divided all the presenting of and being at the different charities or different areas, even the Commonwealth areas where they fly over.
But you know that.
So I say they've changed
You
already.
say they've changed, but they're not ordinary people. And isn't this the difficult thing
But-
for any monarch or any royal
Yeah.
family trying to be something that you are not?
Well, artists are ordinary people, but they say they're not ordinary people. I look at it in a way that it's, as Shakespeare said, the world's a stage. And they do have to play their part, being a royal, and even, I would say, artists, and whoever presents themselves to a very large public.
Do you feel you can all chip in at any particular moment that you want to? And I know
So
you're
that's
itching to
how
say
I
that
feel.
Charles should not abdicate even
That-
when he gets to the throne.
He can't, you know, because the very nature of monarchy must mean that you can't have some sort of, for example, a monarchy by referendum, because if you look at a referendum, what the people would like, a lot of people might very well say Charles at 70 is rather old.
Well,
why
we'll
not
get
skip
back
him?
to that. But Daniel, I mean, let's go to Daniel about this one. Talk about Japan. The current emperor is abdicating. Is that shocking?
It's shocking in the way that he's then connecting to a long tradition of Japanese emperors who abdicated, and in a period between the 11th and 12th century, it had been the abdicated monarchs, emperors, who really took then political power. And concerning what I've heard now in the discussion, I would like to say that in Japan, monarchy and the royal house, the dynasty, they are linked together. So if we think about changing the present system or how it will develop, it's important to be in mind that monarchy is, of course, our concept from the Greek, as we all know, and it's difficult to apply then to Japan. So abdication now will be a kind of possibility to rebuild the present system.
Can I ask you this one? What do you think the monarchy means to the Japanese people?
Yeah, that's a part of their definition of Japanese culture. But one has to be very, very difficult about this, because this is leading us to kind of, narrow-minded nationalism. If you remember, during the wartime and before, the eternal line of emperors was part of the wartime propaganda. It is an ideology. And this ideology was constructed in the 7th century. So partly the emperor is kind of the core, or he's a model to be the core of the modern state. And on the other way, it's the job of the present emperor, and I hope the crown prince will follow his lead, his example, to be more close to the people and not be
which brings us
sterilized.
back to the central argument about all of this, which is, let's say, Jeff, you start with this, and anybody can jump in. How do you prevent yourself becoming anachronistic?
Well, how do any of us stop ourselves becoming anachronistic? I think that the process of change is always difficult to manage when you're in any position of authority. But I want to come back to something that Richard said, actually, which I think in part answers your question. I don't think it is unthinkable that Charles could abdicate.
Well, let's be clear for the international audience. We have a Queen Elizabeth on the throne at the moment. Her eldest son, the Prince of Wales, is Prince Charles, is in the United Kingdom. And some are suggesting he won't get the throne into some part of his into his 70s, that it should go to his eldest son, who is Prince
some
William.
have suggested.
Richard says it ain't going to happen,
Yes.
it shouldn't happen.
I'm not saying that either that it should happen or that it is going to happen. But I think if we say that it could not happen, I think what you miss is the great success story of the British monarchy and indeed of the British constitutional state, which is its flexibility. And we go all the way back to the Glorious Revolution, 1688. And there was no agreement about who should replace James II, who had effectively fled the country and had been deemed to have abdicated. So they decided, well, the Whigs wanted one particular person, Mary, James's daughter, and the Tories wanted William, the Dutch king, who had brought his army over to bring order and had effectively peacefully invaded the country. They couldn't agree, so they decided they would jointly make them monarch. And also, as part of that constitutional settlement over that period, it was clear that...
Are you saying that there is room for radical thought in this?
What I was going to say is, and then Parliament, it was agreed effectively, Parliament decides who is monarch.
Yeah.
And so within the British Constitution, it has this wonderful flexibility. So if we wanted to come up with a new device that allowed Charles to abdicate in that way, it could be done.
Oh,
and
indeed,
that's
of
part of the
course.
strength
I
of the monarchy.
totally agree, because I think you've hit on a very, very important point here, and that is the way the British Constitution is flexible, and the way, for example, we've had over 1,000 years of monarchy, with the exception of the Civil War, which was a brief period, an unpopular one of a republic. But if you want to change, and also if you want the flexibility, whether it's 100 years ago plus 2 years, where the House of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha calls itself Windsor, or whether it's a change in primogeniture, or whether indeed there are various alterations in the way monarchy works, from the walkabouts that we see to a younger generation far more keen to engage with the public.
May I sum up a little bit here? You're saying change is possible, but change in this situation is not necessarily desirable.
I would say that Charles's whole life has been building towards becoming king. Okay. I would say, however, he's created his own role, bringing in your point about the flexibility of monarchy, and as Prince of Wales, done phenomenal amounts for charity. Prince's Trust helping 870,000
We are talking about monarchy in general, as opposed to specific individuals.
And is there not a question about humanity here, which is about recognising that there are times...
It is only half an hour programme.
Well, yeah, but elderly people sometimes need to retire. And is this not unreasonable?
And is that, Maria Luisa, is that something you think the younger royals understand, that perhaps they need to have a more central role? I'm talking about the United Kingdom here. They need to have a more central role in the relevance of the monarchy in the 21st century.
Yes. I think the division is getting thinner and thinner. And the more people require a figurehead for their institute or wherever they're going, the thinning out of the royals, also to maybe cousins and extended, I think it's not going to be as tight as it is now.
Well, I would say one thing. If you look at the way, for example, Bhutan has changed, once an absolute monarchy, and voluntarily the king has given up his powers. Look at the way, for example, Tonga has changed. This is very significant because, I mean, there have been a lot of corruption and accusations there that all was not as it should be. But again, you've seen the giving up voluntarily of powers for a more democratic state. Now, that seems to me very, very healthy. So far as Britain's concerned, it's still got 15 other states in the Commonwealth which have the Queen as head of state. And I think that is very, very
I read
significant.
16. Has something changed?
Well, 16 is Britain itself.
Oh,
Yes,
okay.
out of 53.
It's not that I've
Is
missed
it-
the news.
No, indeed not. But one of the problems, though, of monarchy is if you have a country like Thailand, I mean, it'd be interesting to see how the new king, who's had a very controversial past, manages to succeed his father, King Bhumibol. That will be absolutely fascinating because certain monarchies, that and Japan, they have an appearance of being somewhat sclerotic, and it is very, very difficult to change. Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Swaziland are three others.
OK, well, let's go to Daniel. The new reign is going to be called Rewa. Tell me if I've got that right in terms of pronunciation,
Yes,
or
right,
correct me. Which I think, as I understand it, means order, that's Re, and harmony, that's Wa. But there are some people reading into it that the order could be more militaristic. Now, what sort of person do you think the new emperor will be? Will he be somebody who tries to impose himself a little bit more than his father?
Of course, this is complicated because the first sign means order, as you just said, but it's also the meaning of glorious, excellent, magnificent. So it's a glorious harmony in the meaning. But important to be in mind is that the emperor and his role is not only part of the political system being the symbol of the state, it's also a deep religious function he has to fulfill. And this is interesting because of the separation of religion and politics in the constitution. Of course, after the World War, the Pacific War, then Shinto, what we call the indigenous religion of Japan, but it is a modern construction. One has to be very, very careful about this. But it was a kind of political used system, state Shinto, and this was deemed, of course, dangerous.
Can you just tell me a little bit, very, very quickly, because we've got to wrap this up.
Sure.
Do you think the royal household in Japan has a long-term future? Because then we'll look at it by extension to other countries.
Well, it depends if they have a male successor born in the next decades. But I'm sure that if not, the discussion of a female successor will come up again, as it did until 2006.
Jeff, Richard, what's it going to take to end monarchies as an institution generally?
I'm afraid you're not going to get that answer from me. I think the great success story of the last century has been the survival of the constitutional monarchy as far as world leadership goes, and I don't think they're going anywhere anytime soon.
Of course, there being a big difference between a constitutional monarchy, which is a figurehead, and absolute monarchies. So we're seeing those disappear.
I would think that's a very different matter, yes. But short of great cataclysms like wars and revolutions, I don't think the constitutional monarchies are going anywhere.
Okay. You mentioned Bhutan, you mentioned Tonga. You think there is enough will in the world today for monarchies to adapt?
Oh, I think absolutely. And also, I mean, this has been pointed out a century ago, you might not think so. The late King Farouk, and that was only 60 years ago, said that he thought that the only monarchies that would survive was that of England and those in a pack of cards. Look how wrong he is. They're over 40. If you count Vatican City, 44. And also, one of the interesting aspects of the Middle East, I think, we've got 8 monarchies, Middle East and North Africa, is that during the Arab Spring, there wasn't a single monarchy that was toppled, whether or not they were autocratic. It's a curious thing, but there does seem to be this link with tradition, and also, I mean, as far as Britain's concerned, I mean, above party politics, the link with national unity, continuity, and a certain soft power element, as well as attracting tourists. So, whereas there's sometimes complaints about their cost, it does seem to me that their price is far beyond rubies.
The costs have come down, and it's very obvious that they certainly want to make it public that the costs have come down. Maria Luisa, do you think the British royal family watches this debate with interest at all, or do they just simply think, well, tomorrow's another day?
No, I think they're very interested in everything that happens in their country and out of their country, and also the Queen is so keen with keeping the Commonwealth going with the 53 countries. I think it's 53 countries.
I think it is 53.
Yes.
Some of which have their own monarchs, such as Malaysia.
And like South
Rotating
Africa,
sultans, it's marvellous.
like South Africa, that because of having different people with the apartheid, it went into the Commonwealth, out of the Commonwealth, and now it's back in with Nelson Mandela, who actually put it back again.
It may be that now, when we're living through an age of real political instability in the West, in Europe in particular, thinking about the situations in Britain and elsewhere, that actually constitutional monarchs may take on a greater significance in terms of providing some sense of consistency in a non-party political sense around which a nation can gather, which I think I absolutely agree with Richard. That's been one of the great strengths of the British monarchy, and the Queen's determination to stay aloof from party politics at all times during her reign has been very well chosen, I think.
Even if there are one or two people who would like to see it otherwise and try and use her for their political advantage. We will name no names at the moment because we have to come to the end of the programme. Listen, my thanks to each and every one of you. To Daniel in Bonn, we appreciate the time you put in for this. It is the end of the programme. It is not the end of the debate, and it is not the end of monarchies worldwide. We will see you next time. From me, David Foster. For now, goodbye.